Stephen Pladel and the Pladel Family, 2018.
These pictures show a happy new mother and father. This link, the couple's baby registry. But this...
Picture a perfect family photo. Smiles, holidays, a dining table set just so. Everything straight out of a postcard. Now drag your hand across that picture and watch the varnish spider into cracks. Beneath that glossy surface is a fissure that smells of fear and shame. This isn't a movie plot. It's the real life of Stephen Pladel, his daughter Katie, and the child born between them. A story where love and abuse braided so tightly you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. They looked normal. Snapshots, routines, the little details of everyday life. All of it worked like a mask. But behind it lay a system of persuasion and manipulation. One person convinced he had the right to erase boundaries. Another whose consent might have been less a free choice than the product of years of broken defenses. They married, hid facts on paperwork. Katie became pregnant, and in September they welcomed Bennett, a child whose blood looped back on itself, son and grandson in the same body. Family trees are supposed to branch. Here the line folded into a suffocating knot. Winter brought the law. Arrests, court orders, separation. The instruments meant to divide and protect. For a moment it seemed the machinery had worked. For a moment. Then came the metallic sound of a door slamming shut. On April 11th, Bennett died in Stephen's home, reportedly suffocated. The next day, crossing state lines, Stephen intercepted Katie and her adoptive father, Anthony Fusco, and killed them. He called his mother to confess, and later took his own life. 3 lives snuffed out in 48 hours, as if someone took an eraser to an entire family. What drives this? Control is part of the answer, but it's only a shard. This was not mere jealousy or a spiteful fury. It was an ecosystem of coercion, a web spun until one person's will rewrote reality for another. Think of it as grooming in reverse. Boundaries eroded one tiny concession at a time. Small compliances, hidden records, isolation. In such a dynamic, consent becomes a shaky reflection. It looks like a yes, but means, I don't know any other way. Psychologically, it's a fusion of grooming and coercive control.
The young woman's mother has a warning for parents of adopted children. She says that if their child wants to reunite with their biological parents, they should be in therapy when they do.
Love weaponized into obedience. There is also a darker strain, catastrophic narcissism. When courts tried to sever the bond and Katie reportedly sought distance, Stephen, stripped of the illusion of ownership, reacted as if his identity had been murdered. In those moments, violence becomes theatrical retribution. Erase the witness to your defeat. Obliterate the humiliation. Remove anyone who can claim the thing you feel entitled to. To kill an infant, utterly powerless, utterly dependent, is the starkest testament to a will bent on domination rather than affection. Yet the most painful question isn't only the cruelty of individual acts, it's how and why our systems cracked. Courts intervened. Arrests happened. Katie's biological mother warned. And still the child returned into danger, and legal safeguards proved porous. Where was the breakdown? In law, enforcement, social services, or the ordinary people who saw signs and turned away? That riddle cuts deeper than any crime report. Can we tell the difference between a fully autonomous adult decision and the residue of prolonged manipulation? Who bears responsibility when the line between choice and coercion blurs? Legally, there can be no tidy ending. The alleged perpetrator died, so the courts could not render a final sentence. The record becomes a log of charges, hearings, and then deaths. Frayed threads, not closure. But morally and socially, we can issue our own verdict. This was preventable. Preventable in prosaic ways. Firmer protection for the child. Seriousness toward warnings. A willingness to read patterns of control rather than dismiss them as private matters. How do we mend that breach in the system? There's no simple fix. We need mechanisms that spot coercive patterns, swift interagency responses that don't let a recurring alarm fade into paperwork, and a culture that takes complaints seriously without compounding trauma. We need to teach people to look beyond tidy appearances and to act when signals appear. And finally, the personal loss. Bennett, Katie, Anthony Fusco. Lives erased. What remains is a hollow ache, relentless questions, and a bitterness that won't soften. This story is more than horror. It's a warning. It tells us that outward normalcy is a poor measure of safety, and that the heaviest responsibility rests with each of us. To see what's uncomfortable, to believe the one asking for help, and to act before it's too late. Chris Watts and the Watts Family, 2018. The house on Saratoga Trail looks exactly like the American dream. Wide lawn, two-car garage, family photos on the mantle, a smiling wife, two small girls with bows in their hair, a husband who posts gym selfies and weekend hikes. Now imagine that same house as a movie set, where the actors keep their scripts to themselves, and behind the scenes something has gone so wrong it can't be edited out. This is the story of Chris Watts, Shanann Watts, their daughters Bella and Celeste, and a seamless, deadly rupture that stunned a nation. The facts are stark and terrible. On August 13th, 2018, Shanann, 34, pregnant with a son, and her daughters Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3, vanished from their Frederick, Colorado home. Chris Watts, their husband and father, initially appeared on camera as every bereaved spouse does, pleading for help, begging for anyone with information, posting videos that begged the world to bring his family home. But the performance cracked. Within days, investigators uncovered evidence at work sites and at home. Chris confessed to killing Shanann and the girls, and later told a chilling story about where he hid their bodies. If you read the timeline, you feel the slow, tight compression of a crime unfolding. He called 911. He spoke to friends. He arranged cremation plans, even as the truth was closing like a trap. Prosecutors say that after repeated questioning and forensic leads, he admitted strangling Shanann and smothering the children, then dumping Shanann in a shallow grave at an oil site where he worked and placing the girls into oil tanks. Within months, he pleaded guilty to a string of felony charges, avoiding the death penalty in exchange for life without parole. The courtroom gave the legal closure a sentence: multiple life terms, consecutive and unyielding. Hearing those facts, we ask the same blunt question everyone asked in 2018. Why? There are surface motives: an affair, a desire for a fresh start, financial pressures, shame, and Chris himself invoked some of these to investigators. But motive in a case like this is never a tidy single cause. Psychologically, this is a collision of entitlement and compartmentalization. People with deep narcissistic defenses
from getting away with murdering his pregnant wife and 2 little daughters. Nicole Atkinson knew something was wrong when her best friend, Shanann Watts, didn't turn up for a doctor's appointment. She immediately called police.
I can't get a hold of her. I've called, I've texted. Her car's in the garage, her shoes she wears every single day are right in the front door.
The police body cam video shows Chris Watts arriving home. Imagine his surprise at finding cops already at his house.
Can treat relationships as objects to be discarded the moment they fail to feed self-esteem. Add an affair and the fantasy of a new life, and some minds will, horrifically, put the desire for escape above the lives in their care. There's also a dangerous theatricality to what happened. The public pleas, the social media grief, the casual attention to normal life between interviews. That performance did more than mislead investigators. It manipulated the public's empathy. In real time, the media and the neighborhood became an audience for a man acting grief, which made the eventual confession feel like a second shock. Not just because of the violence, but because the betrayal had been staged. Psychologists call part of this dissociation to carry out an atrocity and then return to everyday rituals. The perpetrator must separate their inner life into rooms where guilt cannot enter.
That split allowed the lie to persist long enough for evidence to pile up. Yet there's a deeper structural question that haunts the case. How did people miss the signs? Shanann's social media painted one picture. Neighbors saw barbecues and playdates. Friends described an affectionate couple. But relationships are private, and pain often hides behind curated feeds. This is the mystery that has no forensic answer. How a family that iterated normalcy publicly could be collapsing in private. Part of the truth is our collective blindness to contradiction. We want to trust the image more than the whisper. And part is how quickly ordinary tensions can escalate in the absence of honest, hard conversations about separation, safety, and mental health. So what is the verdict we can hand down beyond the judge's sentence? Legally, Chris Watts was punished to the fullest allowed by the plea deal. Life without parole, additional years for tampering and terminating a pregnancy. But moral verdicts aren't satisfied by prison bars alone. We must ask whether cultural norms, the worship of privacy, the fetishization of glossy family images, the reflex to assume adults control their destinies, let this kind of catastrophe bloom. Could neighbors, employers, or social networks have noticed earlier? Maybe. Could different social services or a more probing investigation into marital strain have changed the outcome? It's possible. These are uncomfortable but urgent interrogatives. There is finally the personal toll. Shanann, who sold a lifestyle brand and shared her life online. Bella and Celeste, tiny names that now echo like a warning. A son who never took a breath. Their story became a cultural mirror, a Netflix documentary, endless think pieces, and the hashtagged grief of millions. But beyond clicks and commentary lies a human cost that statistics can't capture. Funerals, ruined trust, and a family sliced into before and after. If the media turned the case into a morality play, the true moral obligation is quieter. To teach people to see the contradictions in others' lives, to believe when someone speaks fear, and to act before a polished exterior hides an abyss. I'll close with a final note you won't see in any headline. The Watts case forces us to confront how we define danger in our communities. It asks whether the safest place, the family home, is always safe, and whether our willingness to accept appearances lets violence hide in plain sight. The legal system gave a sentence. History gave us a cautionary tale. Our job now, yours and mine, is to carry that lesson forward. Look harder,
Question what looks normal. And when someone pleads for help, don't assume the worst. Assume only that silence can be deadly. Erin Caffey and the Caffey family murders, 2008. Imagine a farmhouse in rural Texas. Church pews on Sunday, dinner at the table, children homeschooled with Bible verses under their belts. Now imagine that same house at night, lights out. A silence so absolute it masks the slow, deliberate plotting of a teenager who decides to rewrite her family's story with blood. This is the Caffey family.
The police interviewed an ex-boyfriend of Erin's who says Charlie wasn't the first she tried to enlist to kill her family.
Penny and Terry, and their children Matthew, Tyler, and Erin. And the night that split a devout, ordinary life into before and after. On March 1st, 2008, the ordinary became monstrous. Erin Caffey, then 16, conspired with her older boyfriend, Charlie Wilkinson, and his friend Charles Wade, with Bobby Johnson as getaway driver, to kill her mother and her two younger brothers after she was forbidden from seeing Charlie. The attack left Penny and the boys dead. Terry Caffey was shot multiple times and escaped into the night, the lone surviving witness to a betrayal planned from within. The home was set ablaze to hide the carnage. The brutality, reported as involving machetes, gunshots, and a fire, stunned the small town and the nation that watched. Read the timeline and you feel the slow compression of adolescent fantasy collapsing into lethal reality. Erin and Charlie had allegedly plotted for weeks. Erin's parents found the promise ring and forbade the relationship after discovering troubling things online. To her, this prohibition became unbearable, not as a moment of teenage rebellion, but as an existential affront to a romance she felt compelled to protect. That sense of entitlement, paired with peer reinforcement and the easy availability of violent means, turned obsession into a plan. Psychology here is both...
You had a boyfriend before Charlie, right? Didn't you talk to him about killing your parents?
And terrifying. Teenagers still forming identity are uniquely susceptible to charismatic older partners and moral contagion. Add to that the desire to sever ties with authority, the very people who raised you, and the barrier between fantasy and deed thins. Erin's case shows how group dynamics can radicalize. Two young men willing to carry out murder, a driver who facilitated escape, and a teen who recruited them. Moral disengagement follows a familiar script. Dehumanize victims, diffuse responsibility, and justify violence as the only way to preserve what feels essential. It's not only one mind breaking, it's a small network collapsing into complicity. The legal outcomes were stark but uneven. Erin pleaded guilty to 2 counts of capital murder and accepted a plea that resulted in 2 life terms, making her eligible for parole decades later. Her co-defendants received life sentences, some without parole, after pleading or being sentenced in county court. The criminal system imposed severe punishment, but it could not erase the images of a mother and 2 boys murdered in their beds. And then there is the quietest, hardest part of the story. The survivor who forgave. Terry Caffey, shot, burned, yet alive, later expressed forgiveness for his daughter and even those who carried out the murders. That choice sits uneasily with the rest of us. Compassion in the face of betrayal feels heroic, inscrutable, and painful all at once. It refracts the tragedy into a moral question we are obliged to ask. How do you live with the knowledge that the person who plotted your family's end was once your child. So what is the verdict beyond prison sentences? In court, justice was served in the form of life terms. In the larger sense, the Caffey case is a searing warning about the fragile line between teenage rebellion and catastrophic violence, about how closed communities and curated piety can mask fracture, and about how social isolation, romantic obsession, and group dynamics can create a perfect storm. The mystery that stings is not only why a teen would arrange her family's annihilation, but how neighbors, churchgoers, and friends, all who believed in a wholesome life, missed the signals until it was too late. Close on the image of the small Texas home, a place that taught scripture and prayers, but could not prevent a child from choosing destruction. The Caffey murders force us to look at our instincts, to take seriously the warnings of a youth in trouble, to question romanticized silence around family privacy, and to recognize that violence sometimes grows in the shadow of normalcy. If there's a last lesson here, bitter as it is, it's this: vigilance, honest conversation, and community accountability are the thin linings between a family and a catastrophe. Jennifer Hart and Sarah Hart, 2018. Imagine a family portrait meant to be read as proof of love. Two mothers holding hands, 6 laughing kids of different skin tones, a life curated into frames and festival photos. Now imagine that portrait as a stage prop, beautiful, rehearsed, and hiding the stagehand's whispered arguments and the slow rot behind the paint. This is the Hart family, Jennifer and Sarah Hart and the 6 children they adopted. A family the world cheered for, until the day the cheers ended in a crash at the bottom of a Mendocino County cliff. The headline is short and savage. On March 26, 2018, a GMC Yukon carrying Jennifer, 38, Sarah, 38, and their 6 adopted children plunged over a 100-foot cliff on Highway 1. What began as a baffling, seemingly accidental crash soon darkened into something far worse. Investigators later concluded the SUV was driven off the cliff intentionally.
To the latest in the Hart family investigation, a close friend of Jennifer Hart is sharing her thoughts about what happened.
Investigators say Jennifer was drunk when she drove her family's car off the cliff and that her wife and 2 children had a drug in their system. Our Gabrielle?
And a coroner's jury would rule the deaths a murder-suicide. Jennifer at the wheel, Sarah beside her, and all 6 children dead. The wreck that toppled a family portrait revealed, in blunt forensic terms, a planned end. But the crash is only the blunt instrument of a far more complicated tragedy. For years before the plunge, allegations trailed the Harts like a persistent shadow. Complaints of abuse and neglect reached child welfare agencies in multiple states. Neighbors noticed children wandering, unsupervised, hungry, or restrained by strict and punitive parenting. Reports go back a decade, reporting a pattern that included withholding food, excessive punishment, and a general atmosphere of secrecy behind the family's public face. Those warnings, documented in case files and investigative reporting, paint a family that performed progressiveness, adoptive, proudly queer, outwardly loving, while privately enforcing rigid, frightening control. Psychologically, the Hart story is an anatomy of control dressed as salvation. The public narrative the couple sold, compassion, rescue, and a multicultural family ideal, became a vehicle for authority. When parental control masquerades as moral superiority, dissent becomes betrayal. The children, Adopted from different backgrounds and raised under a strict
Dan and
regimen.
Jennifer, Nasheen Bakhtiar met the Hart family at a 2013 concert and became close friends with Jennifer Hart. Now, in the aftermath of the car crash that investigators believe was intentional, a crash that they believe killed all 8 members of the family,
were required to conform to rules that, for some, registered less as discipline and more as erasure of autonomy. Within such a system, obedience is framed as gratitude. Silence is reframed as loyalty. Over time, that dynamic can calcify into a belief system where harming the family, even ending its existence, is rationalized as a final moral act. There are technical details that harden the suspicion into a story of intent. Evidence recovered from the vehicle and data from mobile devices suggested a deliberate act. No skid marks were found on the highway. The SUV accelerated and went off the cliff from a stop, and a later inquest revealed searches and phone data consistent with premeditation. Toxicology reports also added troubling layers. Traces of antihistamines in some family members, and alcohol in Jennifer's system. Details that investigators and reporters flagged as consistent with sedation and control in the hours before the crash. Those facts turn a question of why into a darker question of how far did the mothers plan and prepare? And yet, even with these physical clues, the case keeps loosening into mystery. How did repeated reports of potential abuse fail to stop the final catastrophe? Social services in Oregon, Minnesota, and Washington had contact with the family at different times. Some complaints were investigated, some were dismissed or closed for lack of evidence. Community members later wrestled with regret. Neighbors had seen odd behavior, teachers had raised questions, and images of smiling children at festivals kept suspicion at bay. The puzzle isn't merely procedural failure. It's a collective misreading of contradictions. When a family's public persona radiates virtue, we are peculiarly slow to probe the dissonance. So, what is the verdict we can render beyond a coroner's jury and a closed file? Legally, the inquest labeled the deaths murder-suicide. There was no criminal trial because the alleged perpetrators died at the scene. But moral and social accountability is not constrained to the presence of prison bars. The Hart case indicts systems, child welfare, community vigilance, and a culture that equates curated goodness with safety. It forces us to confront how advocacy for children can be muffled by deference to family autonomy, or dazzled by the optics of a good household. The true failing here is not only a sequence of ignored reports, it is a societal preference for tidy, feel-good narratives over the discomfort of messy reality. There is also an intimate, tragic human verdict. 6 children who were supposed to be rescued never learned refuge. Each name, Marcus, Hannah, Devontae, Abigail, Jeremiah, and Sierra, becomes a relic against platitudes. Their deaths ask us, in stubbornly personal terms, whether being seen on social media as happy can become a substitute for being actually safe. They ask whether love, when instrumentalized as identity or status, can twist into ownership. And they compel a quieter, harder question for every neighbor and agency. What would you notice differently tomorrow? The last image lingers not as spectacle, but as summons. A vehicle perched on the edge, a photograph of unity turned into evidence of ruin. The Hart family murders are less an isolated morality tale than a diagnostic case for institutions and individuals. We can catalog procedures missed and list reforms proposed, but the deeper work is cultural. To resist believing the surface when calls for help whisper beneath it, to teach caring professionals to see coercion, even when it wears a halo. George Billy Wagner III and Angela Wagner, 2018. There's a strange hush in small towns after something monstrous happens. A muffled, stunned silence that presses against porches and grocery store aisles. That hush fell over Pike County, Ohio, in April 2016, when 8 people from 2 extended families were found dead in their beds across multiple homes. It read at first like a horrific, unfathomable act of violence. Later investigations sketched a different, even darker portrait. Not a stranger's rampage, but a plan drawn up inside another family. The Wagners, George Billy Wagner III, his wife Angela, and their sons, went from being neighbors with guns and land to being the center of one of Ohio's most shocking cases. The outline of the crime is a brutal arithmetic. Victims discovered on April 22, 2016. 7 members of the Roden family and 1 fiancé, shot at close range in several houses the same night. The scene was not chaotic. It looked, investigators would later say, like execution. In the months and years that followed, law enforcement pieced together how plans were made, how multiple suspects were implicated, and how a custody fight festered until it metastasized into mass murder. The arrests came in November 2018, when Ohio authorities charged members of the Wagner family with orchestrating and carrying out the killings. If you want a motive, prosecutors pointed to a single poisonous thread: custody. At the center of it was a bitter dispute over a young woman and a child. Relationships tangled across families, social media, and small-town reputations.
Also breaking right now at 5, an update in the Pike County massacre case. So one of the 4 people accused in that murder once knew attorneys.
Yeah, Jessica Schmidt.
Prosecutors said the Wagners plotted to take custody of a girl, and that the plot escalated into an elaborate plan to remove those who stood between them and their aim. The evidence presented in courtrooms and in pre-trial hearings described phone calls, scouting of homes, and a coldly pragmatic allocation of roles. Who would drive? Who would enter? Who would shoot? It is the kind of planning that transforms a domestic quarrel into a coordinated massacre. Psychology explains patterns, but not absolutes. And here the patterns are bitterly familiar. A clan mentality, group loyalty overriding moral restraint, and a leader whose sense of entitlement corrodes empathy. Large, tightly bound rural families often operate in codes of protection, honor, and blood loyalty. Virtues that, when warped, can justify extreme acts in the perpetrator's minds. Layer on that the dynamics of intergenerational influence. Fathers whose commands become law, sons eager to prove allegiance, and you have a social machine that can grind toward atrocity. Add in grievance, the humiliation of a custody loss, real or perceived, and you have motives spark. But motive alone doesn't explain why otherwise ordinary neighbors turned killers. The answer lies in how social identity, rumor, and perceived insult can amplify into lethal resolve. The public performance of normalcy before and even after the crime is part of what makes it so disorienting. Neighbors remembered hunting parties, land that smelled of cut hay, family photos on porches. That pastoral image is a powerful anesthetic. It keeps suspicion at bay.
It also explains why the investigation took time. Crimes committed among known people in a tight community require detectives to untangle loyalties as much as evidence. When arrests finally came, they revealed an unsettling truth. Some of the accused cooperated, some pleaded guilty, and some took cases to trial, and their courtroom dramas would expose the meticulousness of the alleged plan and the cold calculus behind it. There's a legal afterlife to such horrors. Indictments, pleas, trials, and sentences that try to map culpability onto individuals. In this case, members of the Wagner family pleaded guilty or were convicted at different times. One son, Edward Jake Wagner, admitted to firing the first shot and later cooperated with prosecutors, receiving a plea deal, while George Wagner IV was convicted by a jury and given consecutive life terms. Angela Wagner and other members struck pleas in exchange for testimony. And yet one trial after another only highlights how many lives the violence erased. Mothers, fathers, teens, people known to neighbors and loved by someone. But the story leaves open a deeper, more disturbing question. How does a custody dispute become a death sentence for 8 people? There's no single procedural hole to point to. Instead, the case is a mosaic of human failures. The permissiveness that lets grudges fester, the social dynamics that valorize retribution, and the private conversations that graduate into conspiracies because no one stopped them. Small towns sometimes lack the buffer zones, the social services, the anonymous supports, the external authorities that interrupt escalating feuds. Moreover, in communities where machismo and land-based status run deep, calls for help can be misread as family business rather than red flags. That cultural context matters when violence is not an isolated flash, but a planned, collective act. What verdict do we render beyond the court's sentences? Legally, justice moves forward. Convictions, parole terms denied, trials relocated to secure impartial juries. Socially, accountability is messier. The Wagner case is both a cautionary tale about how intimate disputes can metastasize and a prompt to re-examine how communities manage grievance, custody, and the weaponization of family loyalty. It asks whether we have the institutions to detect when a personal vendetta is hardening into a plot. It forces us to ask, who notices the first small escalations and acts to stop them before they become irrevocable? Close your eyes and imagine the rural road at dusk, a pickup truck's taillights vanishing around a bend. That ordinary scene is where the extraordinary cruelty in Pike County unfolded. The Wagner-Roden saga is less a single monstrous act than a slow unspooling of grievance into lethal design. A reminder that the most dangerous plans are the ones hatched by people who know the layout of your life and the names of your dead. If there's a final responsibility here, it's ours. To treat private disputes with public urgency when innocent lives are at risk. And to remember that in small towns, silence can be as lethal as a gunshot. Archie Cabello, his wife and son, 2005. Host, calm, analytical, yet with that storyteller's suspense, speaking as if revealing a hidden family secret under bright interrogation lights. Picture this: Milwaukee, mid-1990s. A middle-class home, quiet street, nothing unusual. Neighbors waved, lawns were mowed, and from the outside, the Cabello family looked like the definition of ordinary.
Archie Cabello, the father, worked an honest job, or so it seemed, as an armored car driver, trusted to guard millions in cash. His wife, Marion, managed the household. Their son, Vincent, grew up learning responsibility, trust, and discipline. Or maybe something else entirely, because behind that normal American exterior, the Cabellos were planning one of the longest-running, most audacious family crime syndicates in modern U.S. history. Their story wasn't a flash of violence or madness. It was something more patient, colder, and arguably more chilling. A 10-year conspiracy built on deceit, loyalty, and the idea that crime could run in the family just as easily as love, faith, or ambition. Let's start in 1995, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Archie Cabello had been working for an armored car company for years. He knew the routines, the vaults, the blind spots. To his employers, he was steady and loyal, the kind of man who never drew attention. But quietly, the seeds of greed were already germinating. What began as small manipulations, a delayed report here, an unbalanced ledger there, grew into something systemic. Archie wasn't alone. His wife, Marion, joined in. Together, they began planning how to rob the very system they served. Without a gunfight, without suspicion. Think of it as the ultimate inside job, a heist written in pencil and patience. Then came December 6, 2005, Portland, Oregon. Archie was now driving an armored truck on the West Coast, far from where it began. That morning, everything looked normal. Just another day guarding millions in cash. But what the company didn't know was that the robbery was already scripted, and the robbers were family. At a prearranged moment, Archie pulled over, opened the truck, and handed off $3 million in cash. Not to a masked stranger, but to his own son, Vincent. No threats, no alarms, no violence. Just father and son executing a criminal exchange as casually as passing a football in the backyard. Later that day, Archie reported the robbery, playing the part of the victim. Police swarmed, headlines erupted, and the armored car company scrambled. But detectives quickly noticed something odd. No forced entry, no sign of struggle, no credible description of an assailant. Just a missing fortune, and a man whose story didn't quite fit together. As investigators dug deeper, a pattern emerged that stretched back years, from Wisconsin to Oregon. The Cabellos had built a family enterprise around deception, money laundering, and exploitation of trust. They used code names, secret storage units, and carefully orchestrated transfers to disguise their thefts. This wasn't a one-time crime of passion. It was a decade-long choreography of greed. The FBI eventually traced the operation, and the facade cracked. Agents discovered that Marion and Vincent were not innocent bystanders, but co-conspirators. Phone records, bank transactions, and witness testimony painted a chilling portrait. The Cabellos weren't simply stealing, they were living a double life. By day, the father clocked in, the mother balanced household bills, and the son appeared to follow in his parents' footsteps. By night, or rather behind closed doors, they plotted their next move. It's the psychology of corruption that makes their story so disturbing. We expect betrayal from strangers, not from within families. Yet for the Cabellos, loyalty was the currency of their crime. They didn't recruit outsiders. They didn't trust friends. Their operation was powered by blood and secrecy, the most unbreakable bond until the moment it did break. When investigators finally confronted Archie, he maintained an eerie calm. He didn't deny loving his family. He denied only the crime. But the paper trail told the truth. The armored truck driver had turned into a white-collar outlaw, using his own wife and son as accomplices. The psychological question here isn't just why they did it. Greed is too simple an answer, but how they justified it to themselves. Maybe it began with resentment, years of guarding other people's money while struggling to pay their own bills. Maybe it was the illusion of control, that if they played the system long enough, they could rewrite the rules. Or maybe, at some deeper level, it was about legacy, the twisted pride of creating a family business that no one else could touch. But there's a line between unity and complicity, between love and loyalty. When those blur, morality dissolves. By 2010, the Cabello empire had collapsed. The FBI pieced together enough evidence to indict all three: Archie, Marion, and Vincent. They faced charges of theft, conspiracy, and money laundering. The illusion of the good family was gone. The same hands that once held each other at dinner now pointed fingers in court. Archie, the patriarch, received the longest sentence. His wife and son also went to prison. Millions were never recovered, cash that had vanished into the shadows of hidden accounts and lost time. And that's what makes the Cabello case so haunting. There was no shootout, no ransom, no desperate violence. Just the quiet corrosion of ethics. A man convincing himself, and those he loved most, that crime could be their inheritance. In the end, the Cabellos didn't just steal money. They stole the very foundation of what their lives pretended to be. We often hear about families torn apart by external forces, drugs, violence, tragedy. But this was a family that tore itself apart from the inside, methodically and willingly, for the sake of a fortune that never brought them peace. A neighbor once described them as private, polite, and hardworking. That may be the most tragic irony of all, because the Cabellos were hardworking, just not in the way anyone imagined. So what's the verdict? Legally, guilty. Morally, a slow-motion implosion of conscience. Psychologically, a case study in how greed can disguise itself as teamwork and how the need to belong can make people accomplices to their own downfall. Behind that tidy suburban house, behind the polite smiles, was a secret stronger than love and deadlier than hate. Trust, misused as a weapon. And that's the story of the Cabellos. The family who robbed not just banks, but themselves. They called it the Broken Arrow Massacre. But before it was a headline, before it was evidence bags and body counts, it was just a family. The Bevers. A neat two-story home in Oklahoma suburbia, manicured lawn, curtains always drawn. The kind of quiet house you pass every day without a second glance. Robert Bever was 18. His younger brother Michael was 16. They were homeschooled and kept close to the family, mostly isolated from neighbors. To outsiders, the Bever home was simply private, not hostile, not suspicious, just withdrawn. Parents, David and April, kept to themselves. The kids were polite when seen. Nothing seemed wrong. But inside that silence, something malignant was growing. It's one of those cases that forces you to ask, how does normal collapse into horror? How do two teenagers, not criminals, not addicts, not delusional strangers, decide to destroy their entire family? The date was July 22, 2015. It was just after 11:30 p.m. when a 911 call came from inside the Bever home. a whispering, terrified voice saying her brother was attacking the family. Police arrived minutes later. What they found was carnage. David Bever, 52, and April Bever, 44, dead. 3 children, Daniel, age 12, Christopher, 7, and Victoria, 5, also dead. Another child, a 13-year-old girl, was severely wounded but alive. A 2-year-old baby somehow untouched. And the perpetrators, not intruders, not strangers, but the 2 eldest sons, Robert and Michael. In the aftermath, investigators pieced together what had happened. The brothers had armed themselves with knives, swords, and protective gear. They'd planned the murders for months. Their goal wasn't simply to kill their family, it was to become infamous. Robert later admitted he wanted to carry out a nationwide killing spree. The family, he said, was just practice. He wasn't insane. He was deliberate. He was calm. And that made it worse. The crime scene was methodical. Rooms showed no signs of struggle. Most victims never stood a chance. The surviving sister, bloodied but conscious, managed to crawl to the phone and whisper for help. If she hadn't, Robert and Michael might have escaped into the night. When police arrested them nearby, the brothers were covered in blood. Yet their demeanor was unnervingly flat. Not panicked, not hysterical, almost relieved. And here's where psychology steps in, because this case isn't just about murder. It's about the anatomy of alienation. Robert Bever had spent years consuming online content about mass killings, serial killers, and fame. He and Michael were isolated from peers, with little social connection beyond each other. Over time, that isolation mutated into an echo chamber. 2 minds feeding off shared resentment, fantasy, and the promise of recognition through violence. They wanted their names remembered. In a twisted way, they succeeded. But what makes the Bever case so haunting isn't just the brutality, it's the setting. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma wasn't the sort of place where the extraordinary happens. These weren't outcasts from the streets or victims of chronic abuse in the usual sense. This was a middle-class family that had every outward marker of stability. A home, a father with a job, a mother who homeschooled, a quiet neighborhood. The neighbors later said they rarely saw the kids. No friends visited. The windows were always covered. The family car came and went quietly. It was the kind of secrecy that seemed harmless, until it wasn't. When interviewed, Robert spoke without remorse. He described the murders as if narrating a video game, precise, detached, unemotional. The language of empathy was gone. His brother Michael, initially quieter, later admitted that he'd gone along because he admired Robert. He wanted his approval, his validation. That's the twisted core of it all. This wasn't just about killing. It was about control, dominance, and devotion turned toxic. 2 brothers against the world, until the world bled through their own front door. The surviving sister later testified that her brothers had laughed during the attacks. She said they told her they were doing it for fun. The statement chilled the courtroom. No insanity plea could wash that away. When the trials began, the state faced a problem. Michael was 16 at the time. Could he be tried as an adult? The answer was yes. Both brothers were convicted. Robert received life without parole. Michael, too, was sentenced to life in prison. In the courtroom, neither cried. Neither asked for forgiveness. The judge said something that still echoes through the transcripts. This was the destruction of the most sacred human bond, family. There is no redemption in that. And maybe that's the hardest part to reconcile, how something as natural as family, the one structure built on trust and safety, can become a prison of secrecy and and hate. You see, the Bever murders weren't just an eruption of violence. They were the final chapter of silence. Years of isolation, no outside scrutiny, no friends, no teachers, nothing to interrupt the spiral. And yet, there's still a question we can't shake. If someone had looked closer, could this have been stopped? Maybe, maybe not. But it forces us to think about how easily tragedy hides behind quiet doors. How privacy can sometimes be the mask of pain. When reporters later walked through the Bever house, they described the eerie stillness, the overturned furniture, the dark stains, the walls that still whispered what happened that night. The home was later demolished. The lot was turned into a public park. A memorial now stands there, for the victims, not the killers. A place once filled with whispers, now open to light. So, what's the verdict? Not from a court, but from us. That evil doesn't always wear a stranger's face. Sometimes it grows within the walls we trust most. Sometimes the monster isn't lurking outside. It's sharing your last name. The Bever brothers wanted to be remembered, but memory has a way of choosing sides, and history will remember them not as legends, but as the warning carved into every quiet suburban night. Behind some doors, silence isn't peace. It's pressure, waiting to explode.
Amityville Murders, New York, 13 November 1974. Imagine a tidy suburban street on Long Island in the autumn of 1974. Colonial houses, trimmed lawns, the ordinary noise of neighbors. The sort of place where you leave your door unlocked and expect your family to come home. At 112 Ocean Avenue, the DeFeo household looked exactly like that picture. A father who worked, a mother who kept the home, 4 children with school books and weekend plans. Then, in the small hours of November 13, everything changed in a single, incomprehensible act. A 23-year-old son walked through that house and killed 6 members of his family while they slept. The brutality of that night cracked open an ordinary life and never quite let it heal. The facts are, for all their horror, simple to state. Shortly after 6 p.m. that evening, Ronald DeFeo Jr. burst into a local bar claiming his parents had been shot. Police found the home and, in the bedrooms, 6 bodies. Ronald Sr. and Louise DeFeo, and their children Dawn, 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, and John Matthew, 7. Ballistics and autopsy reports showed a .35 caliber rifle was used. The parents were shot twice, the children each with a single shot. DeFeo would later admit guilt. Those clinical details are the scaffolding of the case, necessary, factual, unsparing. That clinical scaffolding, however, never satisfied the public hunger for why. DeFeo gave multiple explanations over the years, at times claiming a mob hit, at other times asserting hallucinations or voices in the house. His defense at trial alternated between insanity and admission. The jury, weighing the evidence and the testimony, found him guilty of second-degree murder in 1975. He received 6 concurrent terms of 25 years to life. For investigators and neighbors, the why was less an answer than a cascade of uneasy possibilities. Rage, resentment, mental illness, family tension. The legal verdict was clear. The human motives remained hazy. Psychology offers several ways to read a night like this without pretending to reach a definitive motive. One thread is the slow-building estrangement that can metastasize into homicidal fury, long-term family conflict, perceived humiliation, or the feeling of being trapped under parental authority. Another is the catastrophic failure of impulse control, combined with psychosis or dissociation, when a person breaks from shared reality and acts on voices, delusions, or overwhelming affect. Finally, there is the darker social theory. A young man whose sense of identity and grievance metastasized into violence because his private grievances met a brutally available means. A rifle and a house where everyone slept within reach. Any single theory alone feels partial. Together they form a brittle map of how a family night turned into catastrophe. What made the Amityville case different, and what stretched it beyond a single criminal file into cultural legend, was what came next. Less than a year later, another family moved into 112 Ocean Avenue and fled after claiming a series of bizarre, frightening experiences. Their story became Jay Anson's best-selling book, The Amityville Horror, and a string of films that turned an already savage crime into a ghost story brand. Overnight, the DeFeo murders became tangled with tales of hauntings, demons, and curses. The truth about a thamilicide blurred with the lucrative and sensational optics of the paranormal. The result? A real tragedy recast as pulp horror, and a house that never stopped attracting attention. The cultural overlay matters psychologically too. When a private horror becomes public legend, the conversation shifts away from prevention and toward storytelling. The Amityville name became shorthand for haunted houses and unseen forces, which, perversely, can distract us from the prosaic lessons the crimes themselves teach. People asked whether evil lurked in that home. Fewer asked whether signs of mental illness, family dysfunction, or social isolation had been visible beforehand. In the fog of fame, the victims can become props for a genre, and the systemic questions that might help prevent future tragedies fade into fascination. There are procedural questions that niggle at the edges of the case. Could family tensions have been noticed earlier? Could mental health interventions have altered the arc? These are the what-ifs that don't undo the crime, but matter for what comes after. Courts gave their answer: prison terms and repeated failed appeals. But social systems asked different ones. How do we recognize early signs of a family in violent breakdown, and how do we step in without violating rights or escalating conflict? The Amityville murders remain a stark classroom for those hard-to-answer policy debates.